what if Billy Butcher's tumor wants him alive? That's exactly what's happening with this already broken but still hardened ex-soldier. His sentient parasite is keeping him alive, and that's why Homelander couldn't finish him. But that's just the tip of the iceberg of what's become of Butcher's body and his biology. You see, the man was already pushing his physical limits when he wasn't even a supe, and now things have taken a much more drastic turn. Keeping that in mind, in this video, we're going to explore the 12 craziest physiological facts about William J. Butcher, both before and after his tryst with chest tentacles. So, without further ado, let's get right into it.
Oi, what have you done? Scourge death.
Number 1. Butcher wasn't a supe for 2 seasons, but managed to do what supes couldn't. How? Billy Butcher only took V-24 in the second episode of Season 3. Before that, he was just a regular bloke with no mutant biology or secret supe trait. Okay, let's not call him a regular human being for now, because while he was human, he was also in the best possible bracket with peak physiological, neurological, and psychological states. So what ran Butcher's engine, before Temp V at least, was his extended physical limits, including but not limited to his elite military conditioning and combat skills that he received during the time he served with the Royal Marines as well as the SAS. This training helped him have better stress-driven pain suppression and a nervous system that was trained to know that fear eventually led to death. Additionally, Butcher didn't have what we would call a good childhood. As a young man, Butcher started selling pot. When he was discovered by his headmaster, Butcher beat him up, and guess how he was punished by his father for selling pot and injuring his headmaster? Well, Sam Butcher took his son to a pub to celebrate what Butcher did. Eventually, Butcher came to his senses and started fearing what he was becoming, and that's when he thought his life would get better if he served in the British military. So if you think about it, before getting his body mutated because of V-24 or Temp V, Butcher had other powers, like peak human form and the stuff that comes with that, like strength, stamina, durability, and reflexes. Thanks to his military training, he was also a skilled combatant and an expert marksman, and binding it all together like glue was Billy Butcher's sheer indomitable will. Anyways, our editor asked us to explore if a real human could absorb all the damage Butcher absorbs and live to tell the tale, and we told her what we're telling you now. We don't think the show expects us to believe that part literally, but the base idea is still more or less grounded in reality. Research on military crews under extreme operations shows that acute stress fires up the fight-or-flight system and alters their endurance, attention, and memory, as well as their decision-making under pressure. But these temporary upgrades aren't enough to make a person superhuman, but yeah, all those emotions and adrenaline makes the pain take a back seat, at least for a while. Furthermore, there's a neurological element to this as well. We gotta clarify that Sam Butcher was not a nice man, and Billy saw a lot of violence in his childhood, starting with his home. So, when he suffers deadly injuries but still manages to get back up and charge like a bloody raging bull, it's because his body has been hardened by training, and also because his mind has been warped by trauma, especially that of losing his brother to suicide and then assuming for a long while that his wife took the same path. Maybe that's why, if you're a bad guy, normal Billy Butcher is nearly as lethal as a souped-up one. 2. Butcher's childhood altered his biology and his nervous system. What childhood abuse did to Butcher's nervous system is way more profound than what meets the eye. Throughout the show, it's been made abundantly clear that Sam Butcher was cruel and abusive to both his sons when they were growing up. In fact, Lenny didn't survive that damage and took his own life, and for that, Billy could never forgive his father, and maybe he slightly blamed himself too. So, before Temp V, before the tumor, before any sort of superpowers, Billy learned the hard way that one form of threat or another was always going to be a constant in his life, that a sense of safety was fleeting, and any form of hesitation could get him hurt. You see, this kind of upbringing can recalibrate a developing nervous system in quite a few ways. In fact, research on childhood maltreatment and chronic violence from a parent or guardian-like caregiver can be connected to a heightened threat reactivity, a paradigm shift in a child's stress response systems, as well as structural changes in brain regions, especially those regions that are responsible for maintaining emotional regulation, salience, and impulse control. In other words, a child's brain starts to see something as usual and expected, which makes their fight-or-flight response increasingly severe. Lenny chose flight and ended his life, while Billy chose to fight and ended his dad's life eventually. This is also why Butcher is so daring in the face of danger and isn't afraid of confronting Homelander or other authority figures, and this is why he goes for the strike, and that too at the root cause. It's also why Billy Butcher doesn't give two flying shits about his language, no matter who's standing in front of him. He'll blurt out whatever diabolical shit he has in his brain, and the listener is left to deal with it. The downside of such a troubled childhood is that Billy doesn't have a lot of control with his impulses and can be easily triggered, which, by extension, leads to delayed compassion. 3. What was going on inside Butcher's body in those 24 hours after taking Temp V? V-24 essentially rewrote Butcher's DNA structure for emergencies instead of just giving him powers. As you can expect, every quick fix to any problem comes with related issues. Temporary Compound V gives Butcher super strength, heat vision, and durability for roughly 24 hours. However, its repeated use leaves catastrophic damage behind, including brain lesions that would eventually become a death sentence hanging over him. Now, biologically, a normal Compound V subject usually gets changed early in life, that is, mostly during infancy. During such a tender age, the body still has time to grow around those changes and adapt to the V without any adverse side effects. Butcher didn't have that luxury because he was already middle-aged, so when the V-24 was injected into his fully developed body, a rapid tissue-level reprogramming was triggered. As a response, Butcher's eyes were suddenly producing destructive energy, his muscles and connective tissue were now tolerating impacts that should have broken him into a million pieces, and his skin and bones were now behaving far greater resistance than before. That's like millions of years of evolution happening to your body within a few minutes. This kind of accelerated growth comes with a huge bill to pay. I mean, a body doesn't reach that point in a few minutes without massive metabolic strain, cellular stress, and some really ugly molecular fallout. Furthermore, this helps explain the damage. If every dose tears the system down and rebuilds it on a temporary soup setting, then Butcher isn't borrowing powers in some harmless way. He's asking his organs, blood vessels, brain, and nerves to survive repeated rounds of accelerated redesign. And once those 24 hours are over, the body comes back to its regular state. Imagine working out for 50 years and getting that Greek god physique, only to be brought back to day one all of a sudden. Now, repeat this process multiple times in your head, and then think of what happened to your body. Well, Butcher's body was going through exactly that, thousands and thousands of times in magnitude. That's how Butcher got his sentient tumor in the first place, through the constant use of Temp V, or shall we say the constant abuse of Temp V. In the end, the Temp V-tumor started messing with Butcher's mind, and his dark and good sides were manifested through visions of his CIA friend Joe Kessler and his wife Becca, respectively. 4. What did Compound V do to Butcher's already jacked up and V'd up tumor? In the final episode of Season 4, push comes to shove for Billy Butcher. He's been taking Temp V, which resulted in a brain tumor, and it was so severe that he had less than a year to live. But he kept taking Temp V despite that because he had an evil soup to finish. By the end, his body had given up on him, and the only solution Butcher had was a far riskier one. We're talking about Compound V. In the last few moments of the Season 4 finale, we see that Butcher arrives on the scene where the boys were meeting Victoria Newman. He was seemingly fine this time around. Actually, more than that. Tentacles sprouted from his chest and grabbed Victoria Newman, lifting her into the air before splitting her in two. You see, the Compound V actually mutated the tumor or brain lesions Butcher had. They were now sentient, and Butcher's dark side, that is the Joe Kessler persona, had taken him over. Kessler always wanted soups to die. I mean, all soups. And that's what Butcher wanted too. A soup genocide. In effect, Compound V played with Butcher's wisdom and moral intent by accessing a part of his psyche that was evil. It seems that the V'd-up tumor has more or less taken over Butcher, and if you think about it, cancer cells are one of the most aggressive copy machines in any body. They divide very quickly, they consume resources, and they refuse to abide by normal biological restrictions that nature puts on other cells. So, if Butcher injects Compound V into a body that already has a terminal growth, the drug targets the most active, most receptive tissue first. In other words, the real Compound V didn't really fail to heal him, it's just that the substance found the worst possible substrate and amplified that instead. Furthermore, that's not even the first time the Boys universe has played with that exact nightmare. In The Boys Presents Diabolical, Sun Hee's pancreatic cancer, after Compound V exposure, turns into a separate entity with its own will and glowing tentacles. So this basically sets a precedent, or a rule, that if V reaches your cancer, it might not cure the disease, it may mutate it into something else entirely, something with a mind of its own. Anyways, that's why the compound V made everything worse for Billy Butcher. 5. Butcher's tendrils are super strong. What are they made of? Biologically speaking, the tissue at the end of Butcher's tendrils is almost certainly not normal flesh. It simply can't be, given the kinds of feats Butcher has achieved through them. Much like his heat vision was a boon from Temp V, the tendrils originated because of the compound V-altered tumor. All the compound V did was to mutate the tumor instead of really mutating Butcher. You get what I'm saying? And then he goes on a rampage and uses the tendrils against supes like Soldier Boy and Victoria Newman. And this is crucial to our discussion because Victoria Newman isn't like some B-team supe. I mean, she's super durable, she can withstand stuff like bullets, acid, and even a controlled blast of Homelander's heat vision, so when Butcher's tendrils tear her in half, it becomes more than clear that whatever is present at the business end of those things has to be, in fact, must be, tougher, denser, and sharper than ordinary muscle, skin, or cartilage. In essence, these things are living composite weapons made from V-mutated tumor tissue. They behave more like predatory cables or Lovecraftian monsters. In fact, if you look at the scene where Butcher kills Newman, just before that, he was threatening the boys with his tendrils, and they seem to have mouth-like openings filled with razor-sharp teeth. They definitely have a hardened cutting edge and are fully capable of coiling, piercing, gripping, or pulling things and people with absurd force, all while not tearing themselves apart. How else would you imagine Butcher using his tendrils to lift cars and throw them at people like Soldier Boy? Needless to say, the tendrils obey Butcher's commands and do his bidding, almost as if the tumor and Butcher's own tissue have reached some sort of truce. 6. Since Compound V and the sentient tumor postponed Butcher's death, is he now immortal? If you look at the facts, Butcher doesn't feel immortal per se, but at the same time, he's not a terminal patient any longer. Right now, the status quo is that Temp V gave him a tumor and left him with less than a year to live. Then, a full dose of Compound V didn't really cure that condition, and instead, the tumor gained sentience and turned into a super tumor of sorts while connecting itself to Butcher's dark side. Or, his darker side. But can we say for sure that Butcher's cancer itself has been cured? I mean, if you think about it, usually heroes and anti-heroes end up dying at the end of the show or movie, and Butcher's pulling a lot of that stuff off. We don't want to jinx anything, but we think Butcher's death has more or less been postponed indefinitely. I mean, the older one-year countdown that was given to him no longer applies, and after Butcher accepted his darker side, his gray hairs, his symptoms, and his sickly complexion disappeared. So he may not be at risk of dying of cancer, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he would not at all die ever. But we also think that the sentient tumor, or the reason behind his damn tendrils, is actually keeping him alive. That thing has begun to preserve the host body because a dead host would also threaten any parasite living inside it. So our theory is that Butcher is neither immortal nor terminally ill. He's simply a stabilized host-parasite hybrid, a man whose tumor is keeping him alive. If something dramatic happens in the future and the sentient tumor were to be removed, Butcher would definitely die.
You can see her.
7. Were Butcher's visions of Becca and Kessler psychological, neurological, or something in between? We believe the visions had to be something in between psychological and neurological states. Joe Kessler is revealed in Season 4 to be a hallucination, and Eric Kripke tried to portray Kessler and Becca as opposite forces inside Butcher. Basically, Kessler was his dark impulses, while Becca was the rest of it, or his constraint or conscious. Meanwhile, Butcher's repeated Temp V use or abuse left him with tumors in his brain, which means this isn't a case of a physically healthy brain having a breakdown. This wasn't from a psychological issue like a split personality disorder or depression or the usual form of hallucinations that we find in people suffering from something like schizophrenia. In Butcher's case, his internal debate originated from a brain that had already taken physical damage, and by physical damage we mean the tumor. So no, we wouldn't reduce Becca and Kessler to mere psychology, because the man's psychology itself was now more or less trapped inside damaged hardware. And the sole reason we're focusing on this physical damage is that real-life brain tumors can alter judgment, personality, and behavior depending on where said tumor pops up in the brain. Personality and judgment change when the frontal lobe is involved, and these changes vary with the region of the affected brain. That doesn't prove Butcher's tumor is actually in one exact lobe, but hey, you can be more or less sure that Butcher's moral restraint and impulse control aren't abstract in nature. It's not like they're TV tropes or themes that have become part of the plot to give it more dramatic effect. Furthermore, once full Compound V mutated that tumor instead of curing it, the whole thing became much worse. As we already mentioned, Butcher's been dealing with a secondary survival system in his body, one that's beyond the control of his white blood cells. That's why Kessler is much, much worse than some manifestation of guilt or rage. But at the same time, we wouldn't place Becca in that same category. We think she's the defense mechanism of Butcher's brain against the Kessler parasite. Becca is like a memory or manifestation of grief and the last good voice he trusts. So, if we were to maybe sum it up, we would say the visions are psychological in content and neurological in delivery. Maybe Kessler is the neurological disease that Butcher's psychology is fighting through Becca. Does that make sense?
Really approached it like he was a dual character, like a character with a split personality.
8. Carl Urban says Butcher now has a dual character with a robotic switch. What does switch mean in human terms? In an interview with Screen Rant, Carl Urban said, and we quote, "I had to really figure out who Butcher was now going into Season 5, and I really approached it like he was a dual character, like a character with a split personality. When he would flick the switch and utilize the power, he became very robotic, very Terminator-like. No compassion, just a cold, ruthless killer, a monster." So Urban himself is telling us that the Season 5 Butcher is a dual character, and that when he flips the switch, he turns very cold, very robotic, with no emotion. Now, if we translate that into real human physiology, there seems to have been a very violent change in the way the autonomic nervous system actually operates. The parasympathetic nervous system, which is also called the rest and digest nervous system, well, it handles the safer social rest and digest mode. In other words, it relaxes the body after stress, slows the heart rate, and stimulates digestion, as well as taking care of feelings like urination or even arousal. On the other hand, the sympathetic system handles your fight or flight response. When any kind of threat comes to the fore, the body pushes heart rate and increases the speed at which you can breathe, while slowing digestion and flooding the system with stress-fighting chemicals like adrenaline and cortisol. This is why, in times of urgency, like just before an accident for instance, your reaction time increases. In other words, time practically slows down for you. And in situations where the prefrontal cortex function stops, stuff like your inhibitions or social emotional regulations take a hit. So when people say, "I felt like a different person," that's not some poetic nonsense. Anyways, let's apply this to Butcher's case, and although it is a sci-fi exaggeration, some of it follows the same logic. The real body doesn't become a robot, of course, but then guys, robot mode is actually a pretty decent way to explain how Butcher's body reacts to certain situations, narrowing its priorities and dulling its socio-emotional response to eventually ensure that the problem is fixed. We'd go so far as to say the tumor is actually physically hurting and damaging Butcher's brain, which is why he becomes a whole other person in certain situations. 9. Could the virus kill Butcher? As strange as it may sound, Butcher took the V, fully aware that it would eventually bring death, and that's the irony of his endgame. The man spent years trying to create a pathogen that would kill Homelander. Now, that pathogen locks onto Compound V, and now his own body has the blue liquid. After Ryan killed Grace Mallory, Butcher gave in to the Kessler side, burst tendrils out of his chest, stole the virus, and became determined to kill everyone with Compound V in their system. Now, if the virus finds Compound V and attacks V-modified biology, then Butcher has turned himself into a target. In Season 5, Episode 3, Butcher wanted Ryan to lure Homelander out and throw the soup virus at him, even though it would kill them both, and since Ryan's the first natural-born soup, possibly with no Compound V in his system at all, it would keep him safe, and Butcher would honor the promise he made his dead wife. Although that doesn't pan out the way he wanted, you can be sure that Butcher may well have placed himself in the subset of humans that the supervirus would target and eliminate. We think that's probably how Butcher will eventually end, and hopefully it comes with a redemption arc as he sacrifices himself to save the day. 10. Just how strong are Butcher's tendrils? The Boys essentially starts with a soup crashing into a woman and turning her into a pulp of flesh and bones, so a car being smashed into another soup isn't as impressive. However, when you look at who did it, and how, and who the target was, interest immediately peaks. Butcher's tendrils threw a car hard enough to knock Soldier Boy down, and we know for a fact that Soldier Boy is insanely powerful. Russian scientists couldn't meaningfully damage him with any of their weapons, like they tried everything on him, from blades and gunfire to toxins and radiation. Additionally, even his body neutralized the soup virus that killed several of the teenage Kicks. So the scene where Butcher does what he does, it's not like Butcher is throwing an axe at a log of wood. The scene tells us the tendrils in his chest can create some serious momentum into a target whose whole deal is durability. Momentum is basically the product of mass and velocity. The mass of the car, of course, remains the same, but the velocity with which the tendrils throw the car at Soldier Boy is what makes the difference, and to have a velocity of a high magnitude, you need strength and force. For instance, imagine a soccer player throwing a javelin against an Olympic-level javelin thrower doing the same. The arm strength of the latter is definitely much higher, right? I mean, it all comes down to basic engineering. Like in human biomechanics, force doesn't float through the body by magic. Muscles transmit loads through tendons and ligaments and bones. Next, there are these tendon-to-bone insertions that basically help in the transfer of tension or reducing stress concentrations. The thorax also acts like a stiff load-sharing structure, with the ribcage contributing stability and the thoracic spine handling load transfer. So, if Butcher can launch a car without his torso folding backwards or his chest wall tearing apart, the tumor can't be hanging off soft tissue like a wet rope. It has to be integrated into a rigid frame, most likely the sternum, ribs, or thoracic spine, so the reaction force runs through his skeleton rather than through muscle alone. Furthermore, the tendrils not only hit like a wrecking ball, but, as mentioned earlier, they are prehensile and quite dexterous as well, like human fingers. In other words, Butcher's tendrils aren't really like lifeless whips, they have variable stiffness. "11. What is the tumor doing to Butcher's durability?" So, Butcher doesn't get turned into an ultra-well-done steak when Homelander uses his heat vision on him. I mean, he takes some damage, some real damage, but he lives to tell the tale. Naturally, this means that Butcher's body is no longer anywhere near the levels of ordinary human durability. At the same time, his tendrils themselves don't seem to be as durable because Homelander's beams manage to cut through them, and only after they pull back does Butcher's flesh knit itself back together. You get my point? Butcher's durability itself has several levels, or a hierarchy if you will. Why is this hierarchy even in place? Well, we believe the answer lies in the tumor itself. I mean, Homelander's heat vision is lethal to regular bodies, so the tendrils in Butcher's body are actually not strong enough in themselves, but they made his body much stronger. Like his tissue, his organs, his ribcage, even his skin, all these things have become much more resilient because of the tumor. Like we mentioned earlier, this is all happening because the tumor wants to live, and if Butcher's external body wasn't strong enough, the tumor itself would perish. 12. What's up with Butcher's body after 5 years? I think we established that even before Becca disappeared, Butcher's body didn't really function like a normal human's, and after years of fighting Homelander, Vought, and their minions, Butcher has definitely transformed, or maybe exacerbate. We know he's a soup now, but even if he didn't inject himself with Temp V or Compound V, his body was bound to undergo several changes because of the constant abuse his body has borne, sometimes because of external factors, and sometimes because of his own decisions like heavy drinking. I mean, his body is like the physical record of bad choices, fights, and years of rage. And just when his body was on the verge of breaking, something worse came along and formed a symbiotic relationship with it. So we're not entirely sure if we should be speaking about the tumor like it's some kind of recovery, as far as William J. Butcher is concerned. But if you're wondering what his insides must look like at this point, I think we need to be careful. 5 seasons of beatings, blunt trauma, stress, V exposure, and constant physical strain would leave any human body with a long list of damage, both visible and invisible. Scar tissue, irritated joints, old fractures or near fractures, inflamed tissue, and a nervous system that's been put through hell for years. In Butcher's case, we don't think the tumor erased any of that, we think it just built over it. As in, the tumor pretty much reinforced it where useful, and kept the rest just functional enough for the host to stay alive and healthy, while making Butcher's external body parts like his skin super durable. This isn't quite what we call healing, because healing is about restoring what was damaged. On the contrary, what Butcher experienced was basically patchwork, like giving someone a coat of armor and a dose of the strongest painkillers you got on hand. But let's not forget the stress side, because Butcher is basically a case study in what long-term damage does to a body. Chronic stress keeps the HPA axis active and the cortisol high. HPA is basically the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which is important in maintaining the body's stress response. Over time, chronic stress affects immune function and even leads to inflammation, as well as brain plasticity. In simpler terms, the body loses its ability to repair itself properly, and some people start to age faster, meaning that death comes faster for them. And Butcher's body would have given up sooner or later, even if he didn't take Temp V or develop the brain tumor. I mean, he was gonna die. The Temp V just sped up that process, and the Compound V suddenly halted it. Furthermore, alcohol makes all of this worse. But yeah, we don't want to get into the adverse effects of heavy drinking. I'm sure you're not here to get preached to. In conclusion, repeated V24 use gave Billy brain lesions, and doctors more or less told him the clock had started. Then, by season 4, his body was nearly gone. We're talking fatigue, vomiting, black fluid from the ears, black bile, black outs, pale skin, whiter hair, and bloodshot eyes. Needless to say, his body was in visible collapse, but what really made Butcher's case so interesting was what happened after everyone thought it couldn't get worse. Once he gave in to Kessler, physically, things started to improve for him. Later, the symbiotic relationship with the sentient tumor thing happened, and with that, he recovered and became his former self. Actually, maybe a step worse. And while he may be super strong for now, we're sure Butcher's end awaits him, and it'll come before the credits of the final episode of The Boys rolls. That's all we got for this one though, guys. If you liked this video, please consider hitting those like and subscribe buttons. Those 2 small clicks from you will help us tremendously in bringing you more of these sorts of videos. So, stay safe out there, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye for now.